Gas prices just crossed $4 per gallon across the US. This isn't random. More than 800,000 barrels of fuel supply just disappeared. For many households, the change begins with a number that appears without warning. The price at the pump moves from one level to another, and the difference is immediate. A full tank costs more than it did days earlier. Weekly fuel expenses increase. Over time, that shift begins to affect decisions beyond transportation. It changes how often people drive, how much they spend on other essentials, and how they manage a fixed income against rising costs. In early April 2026, that process was already underway in parts of the United States. In Indiana, the average price of gasoline reached $4.137 per gallon on April 8, according to data referenced in state reporting. Just 1 month earlier, that same average had been $3.466 per gallon. The increase of 67 cents per gallon over that period reflects a rapid change in the cost of a basic necessity. For a household that refuels multiple times per week, that difference accumulates quickly. Each purchase becomes more expensive, and the total monthly cost of driving rises without any change in usage. Because fuel is tied to daily routines, commuting, errands, deliveries, the effect is not optional. It is built into the structure of everyday spending. On April 8, 2026, Indiana declared an energy emergency in response to these conditions. The decision acknowledged that fuel markets were under strain and that the increase in prices was affecting consumers directly. As part of that response, the state temporarily suspended its 7% gasoline sales tax for a period of 30 days. The expected reduction was approximately 17 cents per gallon. The intention was to offset part of the increase that consumers were already facing. In practical terms, the measure reduced the cost of a full tank by a small margin. It did not reverse the overall rise in prices. It slowed the rate at which those increases were passed through to households. At the same time, the state moved to monitor pricing behavior more closely. Officials indicated that fuel prices would be tracked across stations, and enforcement agencies were directed to review whether the reduction in taxes was reflected at the pump. The objective was not only to reduce costs but to ensure that those reductions reached the consumers rather than being absorbed within the pricing structure. This is where the issue of price gouging enters the process. When prices rise quickly during periods of disruption, regulators examine whether those increases align with underlying costs. If they exceed what can be justified by supply conditions or wholesale pricing, they may be subject to investigation. The enforcement framework is already established. In states such as California, Florida, and Texas, price gouging laws become active during declared emergencies. These laws restrict excessive increases and provide a legal basis for reviewing pricing decisions. Agencies responsible for enforcement, including the California Attorney General's Office, the Florida Attorney General, and the Texas Attorney General, have the authority to investigate and impose penalties when violations are identified. The timing of these actions follows a recognizable sequence. A disruption affects supply. Prices begin to adjust within a short period, often within 1 to 3 days. Consumers notice the change and begin reporting it. Regulatory agencies then initiate reviews, which can begin within the first week and continue over a longer period as data is analyzed. The broader context of these price increases extends beyond a single state. By late April 2026, the national average price of gasoline had reached approximately $4.18 per gallon, representing the highest level in about 4 years. Compared to late February, this reflected an increase of roughly $1.19 per gallon, or about 40%. These movements are not isolated. They reflect changes occurring across the fuel supply system. During this period, multiple refinery disruptions were reported, including facilities operated by Phillips 66, Marathon Petroleum, and BP combined. These outages reduced refining capacity by more than 800,000 barrels per day. That reduction represents a measurable constraint on supply. When less fuel is produced, the available volume in the market decreases. As supply tightens, wholesale prices rise. Those increases move through the distribution system and eventually appear at the retail level. The connection between these stages is direct. A reduction in refinery output leads to a tighter market. A tighter market results in higher wholesale prices. Higher wholesale prices lead to increased retail prices. For consumers, the final stage is the only one that is visible, but it reflects the cumulative effect of each step in the process. Survey data from this period indicates how widespread the impact has become. According to a Reuters Ipsos survey, 55% of Americans reported being financially affected by rising gasoline prices, with 21% describing the impact as severe. These figures provide a measure of how broadly the effects of fuel price changes extend across households. For middle-class consumers, the consequences are practical. Fuel is not a discretionary expense. It is required for work, for transportation, and for access to goods and services. When prices rise, households adjust in other areas. Spending may be reduced, savings may be drawn down, and financial flexibility becomes more limited. At the same time, the distinction between market-driven price increases and unlawful price gouging remains central to the regulatory response. Gas stations typically operate on margins of 10 to 15 cents per gallon, with additional revenue coming from in-store sales. When wholesale costs increase or supply becomes uncertain, stations may adjust prices to reflect those conditions. Regulators evaluate whether those adjustments remain within reasonable limits. The process involves comparing current prices to pre-disruption levels, reviewing wholesale cost data, and assessing the timing of price changes. If increases exceed what can be justified, enforcement actions may follow. The penalties associated with price gouging are designed to deter excessive pricing during emergencies. In California, fines can reach up to $10,000 per violation. In Florida, penalties may total up to $25,000 within a 24-hour period. In Texas, fines can also reach $10,000 per violation, with higher amounts possible in certain cases. These measures establish boundaries, but they do not eliminate the underlying pressures driving price changes. Supply disruptions, logistical constraints, and shifts in global markets continue to influence fuel availability and cost. Regulatory action can limit the extent of price increases but cannot fully offset the conditions that produce them. The sequence observed in April 2026 reflects this balance. Supply constraints contributed to rising prices. Government intervention provided partial relief through tax suspension. Monitoring and enforcement aimed to ensure fair pricing behavior. Consumers experienced the combined effect through higher costs and increased financial pressure. The pattern is not new, but the scale and speed of changes during this period illustrates how quickly fuel markets can affect daily life. A change at the refinery level, measured in barrels per day, translates into a change at the pump, measured in dollars per gallon. That translation occurs within days, not months. For households, the impact is continuous. Each increase becomes part of an ongoing adjustment to living costs. Even when prices stabilize or decline slightly, the cumulative effect of prior increases remains. Budgets are recalibrated, and spending patterns shift in response. As investigations into pricing behavior continue, the focus remains on whether increases reflect underlying costs or exceed them. That determination shapes enforcement decisions and influences how future disruptions are managed. At the same time, the broader economic effects continue to unfold across households that rely on stable and predictable fuel prices. At this stage, the conditions that led to the April increases remain in place. Supply constraints, refinery disruptions, and elevated demand continue to influence pricing. Regulatory oversight remains active, and the process of monitoring and investigation continues alongside market adjustments. For consumers, the result is a system in which price changes are both immediate and consequential. The cost at the pump reflects a chain of events that begins with supply and ends with household spending. Understanding that chain is central to understanding why prices move and how those movements affect everyday life. The conditions that led to higher prices in early April did not end with the emergency declaration. The tax suspension introduced in Indiana reduced prices by an estimated 17 cents per gallon, but the underlying pressures remained in place. That distinction becomes important when examining what happened next. By late April 2026, the national average price of gasoline had reached approximately $4.18 per gallon. Compared to late February, that represented an increase of about $1.19 per gallon, or roughly 40%. The scale of that change indicates that the issue extended beyond a single state or a short-term fluctuation. It reflected a broader tightening of supply across the system. The primary factor behind that tightening was a reduction in refining capacity. During this period, outages at facilities operated by Phillips 66, Marathon Petroleum, and BP removed more than 800,000 barrels per day from the market. That volume represents a measurable portion of daily fuel production, and its absence has direct consequences for availability. When refining output declines, the immediate effect is a reduction in supply entering the distribution system. Fuel that would normally move through pipelines, storage terminals, and delivery networks becomes less available. As supply tightens, wholesale prices begin to rise. Those increases then move through each stage of the supply chain. At the retail level, gas stations adjust their pricing in response to these upstream changes. Stations purchase fuel at wholesale prices, and when those costs increase, retail prices typically follow. This adjustment can occur quickly, especially when supply conditions are uncertain or when replacement fuel is expected to cost more. For consumers, the timing of these adjustments can appear abrupt. Prices at the pump may change within days of a supply disruption. In many cases, the increase is noticed before the cause is fully understood. The result is a perception of sudden price movement, even though the underlying process has already begun at the production level. This sequence supply reduction, wholesale price increase, retail adjustment is consistent with the pattern observed in April. The removal of more than 800,000 barrels per day reduced available supply. That reduction contributed to higher wholesale costs. Retail stations, facing those costs, raised prices accordingly. At the same time, the regulatory framework introduced in Indiana remained active. The suspension of the gasoline sales tax was still in effect, and monitoring efforts continued. Officials were not only observing price levels but also evaluating whether stations were passing along the tax reduction to consumers. This dual-process market adjustment and regulatory oversight creates a point of tension. On one side, prices are responding to supply conditions. On the other, regulators are assessing whether those responses remain within acceptable limits. The distinction between justified increases and excessive pricing becomes central. The evaluation depends on timing and proportionality. Regulators examine how quickly prices rise, how large the increases are, and whether they align with changes in wholesale costs. If a station raises prices beyond what those costs would justify, the increase may be subject to investigation. For gas station operators, the situation is constrained by their cost structure. Typical margins of 10 to 15 cents per gallon leave limited room to absorb increases in wholesale prices. When costs rise, maintaining previous retail prices can result in selling fuel at a loss. As a result, price adjustments at the pump often reflect an effort to maintain viability rather than expand profit margins. However, the presence of an emergency declaration changes how those adjustments are interpreted. Once price gouging laws are activated, the acceptable range of increases becomes narrower. What might be considered a standard market response under normal conditions may be subject to review during an emergency. The enforcement mechanisms available to regulators are designed to address this distinction. Agencies compare current prices to pre-disruption levels and assess whether the difference corresponds to documented cost changes. If the increase exceeds that range, penalties may be applied. The potential penalties remain significant. In California, fines can reach up to $10,000 per violation. In Florida, penalties may total up to $25,000 within a 24-hour period. In Texas, fines can reach $10,000 per violation, with higher amounts possible in specific cases. These figures establish a clear boundary for pricing behavior during emergencies. While enforcement addresses individual cases, the broader impact on consumers continues to accumulate. The increase from $3.466 to $4.137 per gallon in Indiana, followed by a national average of $4.18 per gallon, reflects a sustained shift in fuel costs. Even with the temporary tax reduction, prices remained elevated relative to earlier levels. For households, this sustained increase has measurable effects. Fuel expenses rise over multiple weeks, not just a single transaction. The cost of commuting increases. Budget allocations shift to accommodate higher transportation expenses. Because fuel is tied to the delivery of goods, the effect extends beyond direct consumption. Survey data from this period provides a quantitative measure of that impact. According to Reuters Ipsos, 55% of Americans reported being financially affected by rising gasoline prices, and 21% described the impact as severe. These figures indicate that the effects are not limited to a small segment of the population. They are distributed across a majority of households. The connection between supply conditions and consumer impact becomes clearer when viewed over time. The disruption in refining capacity reduces supply. That reduction leads to higher prices at each stage of the market. Those higher prices reach consumers quickly and persist as long as supply remains constrained. The role of government intervention in this process is limited but targeted. The suspension of the gasoline sales tax provided immediate, measurable relief. The estimated reduction of 17 cents per gallon offset a portion of the increase but did not eliminate it. The monitoring of pricing behavior aimed to ensure that this relief reached consumers as intended. At the same time, intervention does not restore lost supply. The reduction of more than 800,000 barrels per day remains a structural constraint until refining capacity returns to normal levels. As long as that constraint exists, upward pressure on prices continues. This creates a layered effect. Market forces drive prices upward due to reduced supply. Government actions attempt to moderate the impact. Regulatory oversight evaluates the fairness of pricing decisions. Consumers experience the combined result through sustained increases in cost. The repetition of this sequence reinforces a broader pattern. Supply disruptions lead to price increases. Price increases lead to regulatory response. Regulatory response aims to limit excess but cannot fully offset the underlying cause. The system adjusts, but the pressure remains. By the end of April 2026, that pattern had fully developed. Prices had risen significantly from late February levels. Supply remained constrained due to refinery outages. Government measures had provided partial relief and introduced monitoring mechanisms. Investigations into pricing behavior were underway. For consumers, the outcome is defined by persistence rather than a single event. The initial increase at the pump becomes part of a longer period of elevated costs. Even if prices stabilize, they remain higher than before the disruption. The cumulative effect continues to influence household finances. The interaction between supply, pricing, and regulation remains ongoing. Each component responds to the others, but none operates in isolation. Supply conditions set the baseline. Pricing reflects those conditions. Regulation establishes limits on how those prices can change. Consumers absorb the result. This structure does not resolve quickly. It evolves as supply conditions change and as regulatory actions take effect. The events of April 2026 illustrate how quickly the system can shift and how directly those shifts affect everyday costs. By the end of April 2026, the effects of the earlier disruptions were no longer isolated to a single state or a short-term spike. The increase in fuel prices had moved through the system and settled at a higher level. The national average of approximately $4.18 per gallon reflected not just a momentary reaction, but a sustained adjustment to reduced supply. The loss of more than 800,000 barrels per day in refining capacity remained a defining constraint. Facilities operated by Phillips 66 Marathon Petroleum and BP had reduced output, and that reduction continued to limit the volume of fuel entering the market. As long as that capacity remained offline, the supply side of the system could not return to previous levels. That limitation shaped pricing behavior across the distribution chain. Wholesale prices remained elevated, and retail prices followed. The earlier increase from $3.466 to $4.137 per gallon in Indiana, combined with a national average of $4.18, established a new reference point for consumers. Even with the temporary tax reduction, the overall cost of fuel remained higher than it had been weeks earlier. At the same time, regulatory oversight continued alongside market adjustments. The suspension of the gasoline sales tax in Indiana was still in effect, and monitoring efforts remained active. Officials were tracking whether the expected reduction of approximately 17 cents per gallon was reflected in retail pricing. This oversight was not designed to control prices directly, but to ensure that policy measures reached consumers as intended. The investigation of pricing behavior also continued within this framework. When prices rise rapidly during an emergency, regulators evaluate whether those increases align with documented cost changes. The distinction between justified increases and excessive pricing remains central to enforcement decisions. Agencies examine timing, scale, and consistency with wholesale costs to determine whether further action is required. For retailers, the environment remained constrained. With typical margins of 10 to 15 cents per gallon, stations had limited flexibility to absorb increases in wholesale costs. When supply is reduced and replacement fuel becomes more expensive, retail prices adjust accordingly. Under normal conditions, this adjustment reflects the mechanics of the market. During an emergency, however, the same adjustments are subject to closer scrutiny. This interaction between market forces and regulatory limits defines the final stage of the process. Supply constraints continue to exert upward pressure on prices. Government measures provide partial relief and establish oversight. Retail pricing reflects both cost pressures and the boundaries imposed by regulation. Consumers experience the outcome through sustained changes in fuel costs. The broader impact on households becomes clearer over time. According to Reuters Ipsos data, 55% of Americans reported being financially affected by rising gasoline prices, with 21% describing the impact as severe. These figures indicate that the effects are not limited to isolated regions. They extend across a majority of households, influencing spending patterns and financial stability. For middle-class consumers, the consequences are cumulative. Fuel is a recurring expense, and increases persist across multiple weeks. The cost of commuting rises, and adjustments are made in other areas of the household budget. Because fuel is embedded in transportation and logistics, higher prices also contribute to increased costs for goods and services. The sequence that began with supply disruption continues to shape these outcomes. Reduced refining capacity leads to tighter supply. Tighter supply results in higher wholesale prices. Retail prices adjust in response. Regulatory oversight evaluates those adjustments. Consumers absorb the final effect through higher costs. By this stage, the pattern has fully developed and stabilized at a higher level of pricing. The initial increase is no longer a temporary fluctuation but part of an ongoing adjustment. Even if prices begin to decline, they do so from a higher baseline established during the period of disruption. The system remains dependent on the restoration of supply. Until refining capacity returns to previous levels, the constraint persists. Government measures can mitigate part of the impact, but they do not replace lost production. Regulatory enforcement can limit excessive pricing, but it does not alter the underlying supply conditions. As a result, the pressures identified earlier remain in place. Households continue to face elevated fuel costs. Retailers continue to operate within narrow margins under changing cost conditions. Regulators continue to monitor pricing behavior and enforce existing laws. Each part of the system responds to the others, but none fully resolves the imbalance on its own. The events of April 2026 illustrate how quickly supply disruptions translate into sustained economic effects. A reduction in refining capacity, measured in barrels per day, leads to higher costs measured in dollars per gallon. That translation occurs across the entire system, from production to consumption. At the point of purchase, the outcome is direct. The price at the pump reflects the combined effect of supply conditions, market adjustments, and regulatory limits. For consumers, it represents a recurring cost that influences daily decisions and long-term financial stability. This is where the system stands at the end of this period. Supply remains constrained, prices remain elevated relative to earlier levels, and the mechanisms of monitoring and enforcement remain active. The relationship between these elements continues to define how fuel costs are experienced by households.